The only pace was the horse's pace. That's what did it for me. That specific memory started all of this. It was a fast horse relay. So one rider would run a horse for 10, 15, 20 miles, get on a fresh horse, do the same thing. What exactly does the land do to the people? I'm fascinated by this.
You have this wide open horizon in front of you, and there's something great about that matches with the idea of freedom.
You're living in a dirt house. It affects you in every way you can think about.
This has had an impact on the psyche of the people there.
I'm about to go win a horse race in Mongolia, and you guys should come along for the ride. It breeds a different kind of person. Everybody's horses were really wired. I rode up behind that guy and stuck my boot up under his horse's back legs, up between its legs, and he went for a little ride. After that, the best thing the horse has going for it is that we love it.
Welcome to the Interlocutor Podcast. I'm Tyrel Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Will Grant. Will grew up in Colorado, south of Denver, and today lives in the state of New Mexico. He's a journalist, an expert with horses, and a world traveler, and his storytelling combines these interests. He joins me today to talk about his first book called The Last Ride of the Pony Express, a book about a 2,000-mile journey with his horses. It's a book full of primary source history that informs a really enjoyable travelogue. Mr. Will Grant, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You wrote in your book that you're a product of the West, that your patrilineal family moved to the Colorado area in the 1860s, and matrilineal family moved to Texas in the 1930s, and from an early age you were afflicted with the cowboy way. Could you tell me about your family ranch near Steamboat Springs, Colorado, and what it was like growing up there?
I basically spent my entire childhood south of Denver, and the family ranch was in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. So that's about 3 hours west of there. But I have very vivid early memories. In fact, I think I can trace all of this to one memory of standing outside a log corral at the ranch and watching cowboys on horseback sort horses for the rodeo. And so there were 30 horses in the corral, and the dust hanging in the air and the golden light coming there and the shouting of the men, horses running to and fro. I almost think that's what did it for me. That specific memory started all of this. So I worked on the ranch, and that's where I learned to love the cowboy way and how to handle a horse and all that.
In the book, you wrote that in the heart of the American West, you see three tangible factors that shape the culture and the people there, that a lack of timber and a scarcity of water and a temperate continental climate, and that this has had an impact on the psyche of the people there. Could you tell me how growing up in that landscape has affected you and your ancestors in ways that contrast with people in the East, say?
Yeah, that's a really difficult concept to put a fine point on. What exactly does the land do to the people? I'm fascinated by this. What did it do for my ancestry? It forced them to it forced a real, for instance, the scarcity of water forces an intimacy with the land, because you have to understand the systems at work in able to make do with not very much water being a key ingredient to life. And so that's the big difference between the eastern part of the United States and the western part, is that 98th meridian. That's what everybody says, which is that line of longitude that separates the east and the west, and that's a rainfall gradient. And so, how does the scarcity of water affect people? Maybe it instills a frugality. So you learn to cherish it, be efficient with it. This sort of brings out that idea in people and that psyche. And so then like the scarcity of timber is the same thing. It's really difficult to make things for the human world without wood, you know. And so building your houses out of sod, you know, that like on the prairies they would use sod, the top like 4 or 5 inches of turf from the prairie to make their houses. You know, how does this affect you? My goodness, you're living in a dirt house. It like affects you in every way you can think about. You have dirt, you know, your teeth will be prematurely worn down because of all the sand in the air. You know, I mean, you're going to have a lot of sand in your lungs and in your gut. So, you know, this, and so what does this do to the psyche? Like, I think this is a really interesting, you know, what does this do to the psyche? How does this manifest itself in the character of the people? And it's like the far off horizons, you know, like sailors know about far off horizons because their eyes are adjusted to the curvature of the earth. And you know, here we with mountains, you're not as limited because there's a mountain that's I can see from my window right here that's 160 miles as the crow flies west of here. It takes 3 hours to drive there. So you can see a long way, you know, and so that I think it breeds a different kind of person, you know.
Yeah, I like that point about the horizon. I've been doing a little research into my own family ancestry that settled on the prairies in Canada, and one of them came from a fairly well-off bar and hotel business somewhere in the Netherlands. And I wondered for a long time, that was one of the most prosperous countries in the world for a long time. Why would someone with decent business in a pretty good country come and move to the prairies where there was nothing? And that point about the horizon made me think that's maybe one of the reasons is that you have this wide open horizon in front of you, and there's something great about that matches with the idea of freedom, perhaps. I don't know. I'm still working on these.
No,
these
that's
thoughts.
right. You know, it really like maybe it's, you know, who else says this is the Mongolians feel very strongly about this, that the eternal blue sky is like the sign of freedom, or it's like the that like is the an emblem of freedom in the largest sense of the word, you know. And so yeah, to be, you know, like it breeds a different kind of psyche than being in the forest for you know your whole life.
As a young man, you took a job training horses and breaking horses, and I think perhaps most people have seen this being done on television. There's a great scene in the beginning of Lonesome Dove where Captain Woodrow Call is breaking that spirited horse that he rides up north and turns his back on it and it bites him. But for those of us, and me included, who don't know a lot about what goes into breaking a horse, could you give some of the basics of what you would have to do on a day-to-day basis in this job?
Sure. So you know, every horse, none of them are born knowing what a saddle and a rider is. And so you have to hire someone, or no, or someone has to show this horse if we want to ride it. You know, like these are the facts of life. We start with the letter A, and eventually we'll get to the letter Z. And so this educational, this like first lessons for a horse are like really important for the rest of the horse's working relationship with humans, because it really sets a precedent. That's the precedent, is those first lessons, you know. And it's not like, oh, I'm feeding it apples and then I like pull it left and I'm teaching it to come to the left. It's like, no, you put the horse in a circular corral and you're like, you're in school now, you know. And it's you have to do what we say. And they're not, the requests are not going to be unreasonable. There will be no pain involved in this process, and you'll get to eat really high quality food, grain
Hmm.
and hay, basically. And so, what this part of the process, the young horse, really fascinated me, and because it's tricky business. You can get bucked off, you can get hurt, they'll bite you, they'll kick you. You got to be smart. It's easy to get in trouble. And so I became a student of how you do this. So how does the day start? It starts like, I would have like 10 horses that all of them had. Let's start all these horses at once. So they've never been ridden. And so the first thing you do is you put the horse in this circular corral and you make it run a circle around you. You drive it away from you for the equivalent of about a quarter mile, which is a horse's natural flight distance. And then the horse is like, I can't get away. And then you start the conversation. And like the horse approaches you, it's already exercised its sort of instinctual defense. And so you're like, okay, like here's the saddle. I'm gonna rub it with you all over you. It's not gonna hurt, Don't worry. And then you're like, okay, I'm gonna put my weight in the saddle. I weigh 150 pounds, stand up. And then like I'm gonna sit on you, and like when we pull this rein, it means turn left, and you got to go slow, And not every cowboy wants to do this. Like some of them just want a horse that's ready for the job. And people all over the world who ride horses, they just want the horse. They don't necessarily aren't interested in spending the amount of time with the horse and going through this process in a way and so that's what you hire people to do this a lot of times. And so that's how I started training horses.
Hmm.
And it's great fun. It's really intellectually very stimulating for me.
You started working for Jack Brainard. He
Yeah.
is a famous horse trainer. Could you talk a little about what that experience was like and some of the things that he was able to teach you?
He taught me more than I can tell you about in a week's time. He lived to be 100 years old. He died in 2021 at 100 years and 2 months and like 2 weeks. So he's born in 1921. So he saw quite a scope of time, in the West. He was in the West his whole life, for sure. And so he was 82 years old when I met him. That's still pretty old. And he was riding horses every day, like 5 horses every day. And so it was a big ranch that had like 100 horses. So I would have like 20 horses at a time that I would work, and he would like coach me through it and say like, do this, don't do that, or like try this with the horse. But the things he really taught me are like how critical a knowledge of the horse's anatomy is to training horses, to like knowing, because their body function is like critical to everything we do. So he taught me to be a student of that. He taught me about like working off a horse's natural instincts, and then about, he taught me a lot about working horses. And he was a really strong influence in my life. And probably mostly what he taught me is that just be patient. You always have another day coming tomorrow. If I was like upset with the way things had worked, or like I was having trouble, he's like, well, the good news is you got another day tomorrow. You can try again, And so that's a good attitude with horses. Like we don't have to do it all today. You can like don't ever lose your temper. Don't ever get in a hurry. Just be calm and methodical. And for him, nothing was ever a problem. He's like, oh, it'll be fine. So that's a good attitude.
Yeah, it sounds like a good influence to have that patient, methodical mentor who has that kind of attitude. And keeps the young man, I guess, calm and
Yeah.
you know, oh, I wanted to ask you about the decision to go to journalism school. How old were you when you decided that you wanted to do that, and what went into that decision?
Well, I've always liked to write,
Yeah.
and I've always read a lot. Um, I was just, so I was like 28 or 29 when I went to journalism school. And I just looked around at these horse trainers and nobody was making any money. I was like, I'm just going to do this the rest of my life. And it's just, it looked like I was working so hard. I leased my own place and I had like 15 horses there and I was working every day, all day, every day. And so I was like, man, I got to do something different. So that was a good decision. And like I said, I always wanted to write.
Hmm.
So, and Jack had written like 6 books.
Yeah.
So that was probably part of it too.
How did the opportunity to go to Mongolia arise, and what was your experience there like?
So I was working for Outside Magazine. After journalism school, I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico to work for Outside Magazine. And I was really trying to find a way to write a feature story, big story. Like I wanted a big story. And so then I saw this advertisement, and I wasn't even on social media. I forget where I saw it. It was like, but for this horse race in Mongolia, and it looked like a bunch of tourists out there. But it's a 1,000-kilometer horse race, and so I wrote a pitch to the magazine, said I'm about to go win a horse race in Mongolia, and you guys should come along for the ride. And so they took it. They said, go for it. We'll send you to go, run horses across Mongolia. And it was a big time. And I was thinking I was going to win it. There were 2 guys there who had done it the year before who wanted to win this year. And I was like, no, boys. 2 guys from South Africa. And right before the race started, on like 7 o'clock in the morning, it was rainy and it was cold, and everybody's horses were like really wired. And everybody's sort of walking around in a circle. And I rode up behind that guy and stuck my boot up under his horse's back legs, up between its legs. And he went for a little ride after that. And I was like, I'm gonna rattle these guys' cage and I'm gonna win this horse race. And they were pissed. He was pissed off about that. But the horse kicked me, and I was like, "What, dude? Your horse kicked me." But I caused it. But then we started the race, and I was like, "There's no reason to win this race." I was like, "This is the most awesome thing you could ask for, to be able to ride 1,000 kilometers across Mongolia in like 8 days or whatever." And so I was like, let's just take our time. And it really had an impact on me. I mean, it was so, the Mongolians, for an American cowboy, it's like kindred spirits. There's a lot we have in common. And so I came in last place in the race, but I could have turned around and done it again. It was like, it was fun and it was thrilling. And I spent 6 weeks in Mongolia after that race, just like palling around with like hunting and riding horses and all this stuff. And then I went back the next summer, because after that story came out, a literary agent reached out to me and said, why don't you write a book about Mongolia and Mongolian horsemanship? And I said, that's a great idea. So I went back to Mongolia the next summer for 3 months, and I never could write a book about it, but it really opened my mind to like the global community of horsemanship. as like a very primitive, far off example, like the most unrefined horse human relationship on the planet.
The book that we're going to talk about today, The Last Ride of the Pony Express, could you first start off by saying what the Pony Express was and how long it lasted?
Yeah, so the Pony Express was a mail service for letters, only for letters, between Missouri and California in 1860. And Missouri was the farthest east that the railroad went, so mail service beyond that point was a challenge because there were about 380,000 people living in California. This is like 10 years after the California Gold Rush. So there was significant population, and they wanted better communication with the East. And especially as the Civil War was heating up, that would go in 1861. Communication between the far west and the east was a priority. So 3 men, an independent firm, set up an express mail service between Missouri and California, where it was a fast horse relay. So one rider would run a horse for 10, 15, 20 miles, get on a fresh horse, do the same thing. Each rider would cover about 100 miles. So a letter could go from Missouri to California in 10 days. And that was about 2,000 miles. And that was beating the other options for sending a letter were by steamship that went down to Panama and then up the Pacific coast. And then there was also a stagecoach route, and that took about a month. And there was a stagecoach route through the southwest of the United States that also took about a month. So the Pony Express was an express mail service, and it cost $5 for a letter, and that's about $160 today, US dollars.
So after the mail arrived in California, what would happen to it? Would it go from Sacramento down to San Francisco? Maybe?
It would. And it would go to, yep, that's right. And then down to Los Angeles, San Diego. And same with the mail going, it was a westbound and eastbound service, and it was twice a week. And like I should say, it only lasted for 18 months. So it was very brief because
Is that because, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Logistically, it was a massive undertaking of horses and stations, way stations, relay stations, massive undertaking. So, but also, like, if you sent a letter from San Francisco to New York, it would go from San Francisco to Sacramento, Pony Express to Missouri, and then railroad from Missouri to New York.
There was an interesting advertisement to recruit riders that for the Pony Express that went, wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders, willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred. So this was dangerous work that these riders were doing.
This was dangerous work, you know, and the danger of it is that traveling at speed on a horse is always dangerous. You know, once you increase the velocity, the potential for bad things to happen increases. So, you know, running these horses at night, you know, through bad weather it may sound like not very much fun, but it's dangerous. You know, you got to be careful. Horses fall down and bad things happen. And they were doing it in like a largely unpopulated area. You know, they went through some Native American areas definitely and had some interaction with them. And there was some U.S. Army movement out there, but it was a pretty lonely job and dangerous because it was in a remote place because you were going fast on a horse and there was no one around to like scoop you up off the prairie if you if you wiped out under your horse or something.
How did you first get interested in this part of American history?
I mean, I've heard about the Pony Express my whole life. I think a lot of kids in the West interested in horses, they're going to hear about the Pony Express pretty quickly. Bunch of children's books on it out. But, for me, I read Christopher Corbett's book, Orphans Preferred, titled after that fictional ad. And I was like, boy, there's a lot missing, from the historical record. And that piqued my interest initially in the Pony Express.
Name Pony Express, did they actually use ponies? Was that better than horses for this kind of work?
No, they used pony. So in the West, you can say like a cow pony is any horse,
Okay.
no matter the size. And so they were using any type of horse they could get. Like when you're doing this much running on horses, you wear out horses pretty quickly, or they get hurt, injured, sore, whatever. A lot of things happen. So you need a lot of horses. And they were riding mules and horses that were half broke, poorly trained. Like they were riding anything. So, but some of them were certainly small horses, but then some of them were certainly bigger horses, like more thoroughbred type horses too.
So you decided that you were going to do a journey by horseback and follow along this Pony Express route. The first thing, or one of the first things you had to do, was find suitable horses for this kind of journey. So could you introduce Chicken Fry and Badger and tell us how you found these horses and why they were the right fit for this kind of job?
Sure. So Chicken Fry I found through a mutual friend, because I was asking I said, I'm looking for horses, and so I'm willing to talk to anyone. And she said, well, call this man Jerry Spear, who's a cowboy and sees a lot of horses. And I called Jerry, and he said, if I was going to do what you're going to do, there's two horses I'd ride, and one's dead, the other's Chicken Fry. So I was like, I better go look at Chicken Fry. And he seemed, two things really struck me the first time I rode him. And one is that he could really walk fast. And that's important when you're looking at a journey of 2,000 miles. We want one that walks fast. And he was like really sensitive. He was, and when a horse is sensitive, it means they're smart. Because like if you ask the horse to stop walking and you do it very subtly, but they respond, it shows like good cognition. That's what you want. And he did. Because like what I was worried about was like a horse stepping on a beer bottle on the side of the highway, And so I wanted a horse that was like smart enough to see the beer bottle and walk around it or not step on it. And same with like all kinds of trash, and who knows what you're going to run into on 2,000 miles. And so he felt pretty good to me, Chicken Fry did. And I'm really glad I bought that horse. I'm really glad I bought that horse. And one thing Jerry Spear had said to me, he said that I would, checking cattle, I could do a 25-mile loop on Chicken Fry and be done by noon. So that's pretty good. If he's doing that like 5 days a week, boy, that horse is like, that's sounding like my kind of horse. And then I was sorting through, so I got Chicken Fry. Then I got an Arabian horse. You familiar with Arabian horses?
No.
No. It's a breed that's good at long distances.
Okay.
It was bred in the Middle East. But they can be difficult to handle, fractious of the brain. And this horse was not good. And I kept looking for other horses, and I saw an ad online for a horse. Then the ad said like brush, rocks, rough country. This horse can handle it all. And so I went and rode him, and he was really athletic. He felt like a racehorse to me, and he was big. Chicken Fry is not a very big horse. Chicken Fry was born in Mexico. Mexican horse. He's like the opposite of Badger. Badger is like a very fancy looking tall horse with an arched neck, long stride. He looks like he could be in the Kentucky Derby, looks like a racehorse. And so, but I said, I think this horse, he was really good to handle, also sensitive. And so I bought him and brought him home, and I said, meet your new best friend, Chicken Fry. So, and I have the horses and still, and they turned out to be the right horses.
Yeah. So one other question I want to ask about your preparation, how does your pack and the things that you're going to take with you differ from what someone might have in, say, the 19th century?
A lot of ways.
Yeah.
I mean, I was sleeping. I had an inflatable air mattress that was like 3 inches thick, very comfortable, weighs 1 pound, very lightweight. I mean, the Pony Express riders would have loved that, I mean, they were sleeping on the cold ground every night, So, I mean, really, I thought about this, and material are like synthetic materials. Our materials for our gear and everything has come such a long way. I started the ride with 6 brand new pairs of heavy wool socks, really nice socks, because like a pair of dry socks can like really help morale. Like after a cold, hard day, to be able to pull on a pair of dry, warm socks is a big deal. And so the Pony Express riders, I was like, how do they keep their feet warm in the winter? Like, I mean, my gear, I had pretty good gear, and I had a little for boiling water in the morning for coffee and oatmeal. It's a little jet boil stove that's like this big. And I mean, it boils water in like, a minute. Pretty nice. But the big deal is that I had a mobile phone to navigate on. That was critical to finding quiet roads. So I wasn't on the side of a highway, critical to finding landowners, like judging mileage. Man, the mapping apps on the phone made a big difference for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to the west of Hannibal, Missouri, on the Mississippi River, is a place called St. Joseph. And at the time of the Pony Express, what was St. Joseph?
It was a river town. It is still a little bit, but it was really a town on the Missouri River where they could, a lot of grains, like cereals, grain went south down the river to the Gulf of Mexico. So it was I think it was a pretty, it was the biggest, there was nothing west of there. It was basically the end of everything, as far as the U.S. was concerned.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really liked in the book was when you began your journey, this man named Lyle Ladner, who was the president of the National Pony Express Association, he was there as you were leaving, and he shouted, "Pony Rider up." And so I'm interested in your feelings as you embarked on that journey, and to have someone like that there say something like that, I thought that made it interesting and significant that happened.
Yeah, that was a cool morning, and yeah, and Lyle certainly made it special. That was a fun. That was one of the most fun parts of the journey, probably right there. There were a lot of fun parts, but that first morning was pretty cool.
You said that a place called Fort Carney deepened your relationship to the Pony Express in ways that you hadn't expected. Could you explain where Fort Carney is and why it had that effect?
Sure, Fort Carney. It took me about a month to get there, and and I don't know what the mileage is on that. Probably may have taken me only 3 weeks, but anyways, once I got there, I was sort of broken in. You know, I was feeling pretty good about things. I was at least started and had my system more or less figured out with the horses and everything. And so at Fort Carney, when I showed up, there was suddenly a lot of history I was seeing about immigrants in wagons, and like you hear a lot about this, that there's all the trail side graves, because people dying of cholera, and it was so difficult for the families and all this stuff. And so I was like, what that made me realize is that's what separates me from like 99% of the people in the world, because I'm not, like I'm a horseman. And that's what the Pony Express was. They were like running past these wagon trains, and they didn't want to associate with them, and they saw life at a lot faster speeds. And they were like 5 feet higher than the rest of the population, and so this like ingrained me into this persona of the Pony Express, and in a way that I hadn't seen in comparison to like the wagon trains of families. It just sounds like a disaster. I would much prefer to be a Pony Express rider than to be, walking beside a milk cow going to Oregon,
Uh, what were your impressions of seeing rural America in terms of over the last 40 years or so, there's been this steady urban flight, urbanization, and people are moving and living in cities now. So how what was your impression of the landscape in terms of how people were living there? It's no longer this Jeffersonian ideal of small farms all across the prairies
right.
and yeah.
Yeah. In the rural West, a lot of people locate themselves, or their sense of geography is like how far to a Walmart, because that's like where you buy everything. And so, the family farm is like looks a lot different. The corporate farm is a lot easier to find than the family farm. And so what is this doing to, the next generation of farmers? And it's pretty clear that they're going to be harder to find. Pretty soon the tractors are all going to be driven remotely, like I say in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's farming is changing. There's like highly, automated farms in parts of Europe that are just like all robots and stuff. So it's going to happen to parts of the West, and it's going to happen on farms still. And the farms, as you're going west, you run into steadily fewer and fewer farms and more ranches, because it's more arid, and the soil and everything else.
I forgot to say earlier when we were talking about St. Joseph, I have this raggedy old map from the 1990s of the United States, and it shows the topography, and so I love it for that reason. But I looked in at Missouri, and it has St. Joseph Pony Express on that map. So
Oh,
I thought
nice.
that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's good.
Uh,
Yeah.
uh, oh, I want to ask you about uh, as you were getting into the journey, could you talk about the difficulty or balancing act of finding the right pace, where the pace that you had expected to take and the pace that was comfortable for the horses to sustainably do over a long period of time.
It became pretty clear early on that the only pace was the horse's pace. You gotta, I mean, I realized right after Fort Carney that the slower I go, the faster I'll get there, because like hurrying is just gonna like tax the horses. And if I overtax the horses, then I'm gonna be in big trouble. This is gonna be a pain in the butt to deal with. So I was like, I just have to you just constantly monitor the horses, and that's definitely the metronome by which you travel.
If one looks at a map of the United States, and so say we're starting in Missouri, it looks like you, and I know this isn't a perfect representation of how the globe actually is, but it looks like you can go almost straight across to Sacramento, California. But the route that you have to take is to go up into Nebraska to find that, I need to check the name of it.
Platte River.
Yeah, that point where it's best to cross through the mountains.
That's right.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I most enjoyed about this book was what it taught me about the topography of the United States, and how that was a big determinant, and not just what you had to do this journey, but what all the settlers in the West had to deal with when they were coming out here.
Yeah. Certainly that's right. The topography and the climate were strong factors.
I had never paid attention so much before, but after reading your book, I was looking on this map, and Nevada is just full of hills and mountain ranges. You described it as the army of caterpillars marching towards Mexico?
Yeah. That's a famous remark by a geologist. Yeah.
You met and stayed with people you described as mountain men. So I'm interested in how someone that fits that description in the 21st century compares to someone like Jeremiah Johnson of the mid-19th century.
Probably not a lot different. I think today they'll be literate. They can read. So but there's certain qualities, there's, ways that they're different is perhaps maybe it's more helpful to ask in what ways are they similar, in this sense of like nobody can really tell me what to do. I'm a free man. Yeah. And like I don't respect any law except for the law of the land. This self-reliance and resourcefulness and freedom and irreverence, I think are certainly have been inherited for sure.
Could you talk about the Western Utah Basin and Range, the Great Basin Desert, between Salt Lake City and Nevada? There were a number of challenges for you to cross this area, and a number of challenges for the Pony Express riders in this area as well.
That's right. It's a challenging place. Are you familiar with the Donner Party?
Only superficially. I've heard
they
of it.
they were immigrants that got stuck in the mountains of California and resorted to cannibalism.
Right.
And the reason they got stuck in California is because of this desert in Utah, because it was so difficult for them to cross and had such a detrimental effect on the livestock that they were delayed, and then they got stuck in the snow. So it's a really austere landscape, It's very dry, very dry. And it's the bottom of an old lake bed. So it can be white as snow and flat as a billiard table. But there's mountains around it. So with very little vegetation and very little water. Yeah. And so all of the resources, except for sun and wind, are very scarce. That was a challenge for the Pony Express riders, and that was a challenge for me.
In the book, you were working out how they would have gotten water to some of those stations. It would have had to been an entire operation going on all the time outside of the riders doing what they were doing.
That's so right. They wanted stations between water sources so that they could run the mail faster. And those stations had either very poor water or no water. And so to haul water to them, it's a mind-boggling, mind-boggling that someone would actually think this is a good idea. That's what I can't, the fact that they actually did it is crazy, because it would have been very difficult, but they did.
So as you descended from the Sierra Nevadas, you reached a point where your instincts told you that this may be too dangerous for me to keep going with the horses. And so there was a little stretch where you wanted to avoid the highways and such. So could you take me through what you were seeing there and as you look back on it, I imagine you're still glad you made that decision.
Oh yeah. That's right. So when I had come from Nevada, it's empty, it's beautiful, very quiet, and right near Lake Tahoe. I entered the Sierra Nevada right at Lake Tahoe, which is like a summer recreation mecca. It's beautiful, beautiful mountains, beautiful big trees, Lake Tahoe. The lake is beautiful. And so it was so crowded. And it was, the other thing I'm going to say is that it was so dirty. It was full of trash, like the national forest, there was trash all over the place. Every campsite had like little piles of toilet paper behind every tree. That kind of trash. Like a lot of people. That's the kind of trash I'm talking about. Not like just garbage everywhere, but just like it just gets so much recreation, that area. And people were driving fast, and it's narrow canyons. And I was like, boy, these horses don't need to do this. I was like, if you give me a fresh horse, one horse, I'll breeze this sucker into Sacramento in 2 days. But I didn't want to do that. It was like I had satisfied what I wanted. And just to think about what Chicken Fry and Badger had been through, and then to think that there was like the risk of like a mountain biker coming down a trail and crashing into us or something. I was like, this is just insane, and I was like, I have nothing to prove. I never held, the only standard was the well-being of the horses and then myself, right? You can't hurt yourself, and you don't want to tear up the horses. So at that point I was like really disenchanted, so, and I didn't really I don't really care what people think about that or whatever. If I didn't ride the last, or that section of trail that's like 30 miles there or whatever, it makes absolutely zero difference to me.
When I read that part of it, I thought it showed a different integrity, that throughout this entire journey you cared about the well-being of these horses, and you continued to in that decision at the end. So
yeah. And that's, and Yeah, so maybe that's like part of what the old man Jack Brainerd taught me. Like be smart.
Yeah.
And like your horses, the best thing the horse has going for it is that we love it. End of the day. So you better act like it.
Great. I want to ask you something about the writing process. Throughout the book, you never mention taking notes. So I'm wondering if you'd give me a few glimpses and insights into how you were jotting down what was happening, because
Yeah.
you have quite a lot of vivid descriptions of people, dress, of landscapes. So I
Yeah.
imagine you were taking notes while doing all of this.
I absolutely was. I kept like a thicker notebook in my bags, my packs that I would write in every night. And then I carried a smaller notebook in the breast pocket of my vest and a pen. And if I needed to jot things down really quickly, like phone numbers and contact information and stuff. But, I used my phone and dictated into it a lot. A lot. Right after I met someone, I would say like he was wearing a brown hat and a red shirt and he had holes in his jeans or whatever. And I'd say I met him here at this intersection. And then I would at least have a record of it.
Yeah.
And I took photos of all the plants that I saw. I used my phone as a real tool in that way.
Just one last question I want to ask you, and I like to ask all my guests this as a final question, and it's about the subtitles of their books. So the subtitle is a 2,000-mile horseback journey into the Old West. So I'm interested if you could talk about those last words of that subtitle, into the Old West. What is the Old West for you, and were you able to find that, and were you able to get into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So, this is a good point because what that journey did for me, best summer of my life. Best summer of my life. Horseback every day. Chicken frying badger and I, riding down Main Street into town. But what it did is it gave me perspective, on like what's happening now with the farms. What with the invasive species, like what's happening now. And so what's the Old West? Like the Old West is like the Pony Express. The Old West is like before the Pony Express, when it was just like trappers. It's before there was even a white man on this continent. It's back like when you look at the Ice Age, and the way those lakes filled up in the Utah desert, and so I think that it's like a fitting subtitle because it just helped me understand where we are now. To understand the present, you have to think about the past, I think, to gain perspective on where we are and where we're going. Perspective on where we are and where we're going comes from perspective on or understanding where we've been and where we've come from.
Right. Well, the book is The Last Ride of the Pony Express. I really enjoyed this book. I love talking to guests who bring something both to history and travel and the art of writing. So I thought this book was great in that it covered all of those aspects that I'm interested in.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you saying that.
I also want to thank you very much for your time today. I enjoyed the conversation and getting a chance to meet and talk with you.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure. Really good conversation. Fun for me to talk about it. So thank you for having me.